Joanne had asked me to say a bit about the native tradition around the Day of the Dead or of death in our communities. When we talk about death, we talk about the passing or transitioning into another life. And so death is a part of our life and a part of our journey. And that when we look at our ancestors, it's not as though they're there to judge us. They are there to comfort and to commune with us, especially in times of problems. What this means is that we connect to that wisdom and their example and their judgment in trying to relate our story and our life to God. And so one of the important aspects is the finding of our place and how we fit into our families, how we fit into our communities, how we fit into our societies with one another. Recently, I was at the opening ceremony for the Interfaith Harmony Week, and there, one of my things that my sister was talking about was how it was nice to finally get to a point where we can just sit and relax and share and have communion in our faith and to understand one another and to come to terms with the changes in our lives, and gives us a better scope of our place within our culture and where we're going and where we want to be. And so that's kind of the message out of the aspect of death. What we do on the reserve is we commemorate that by having an annual day or time of the year when we reflect on that. And we go to the grave sites, we prepare them in a particular way, we do certain ceremonies at the sites, and we give thanks and honor to those that have gone on. And so this past fall, we did that. This is a certain time of year that you do it at my father's grave site. My mother is born, or was born in the United States in Yuma, Arizona. And so she wanted to be buried at her homeland so that we remembered that connection. So we go down there to have special ceremonies for her. She's from a different indigenous culture, and when we had her funeral, there was a 4-day wake at a community house, and they prepared the body, and at the end of that, at the morning of the 4th day, they would construct a big pyre, and then they would set fire to it, and with all the songs and ceremonies. And so it's a real awakening for me to understand how important that life and that transition, that letting go is, and how we hold on to, as Joanne was saying, those memories, those understandings, and we connect to that in a way that bridges us between the worlds. When we do ceremonies in Morley, we do particular ceremonies in houses and in sweat lodges and in sun dances, where we call upon the ancestors, the traditional people. We're calling upon their spirits. We're calling upon the spirits of those that have gone before us to observe and to connect with. And in that, we pay homage to where we've come from, and we give thanks for their journey in our lives and how it affects us into the future. And so I'll just leave it at that.
There's this concept in Celtic Christianity in particular but one that has really bled into our daily lives, of what we call the thin place. That's the spaces in the world, maybe even in our lives, where the boundary between heaven and earth seems to be erased, not completely, but enough so that you can sense the other side, sense the divine as closer and less removed than it is in most of our everyday. And I suppose that is the concept behind the Dia de los Muertes, which is this sacred holy day celebrated mostly in Mexico, although many, many cultures have holy days for celebrating ancestors. But in Mexico, it's this holiday that honors the dead, your ancestors, the people who have had an impact on your life and helped to shape your days. So I guess the translation in English is the Day of the Dead. And although sacred days honoring ancestors have been common, especially amongst Indigenous peoples, when Christianity became pervasive in places like South America, those ancient festivals became wed with Christian theology, and the Day of the Dead became All Souls Day. So it's actually a 3-day festival. Bob, you're going to be so proud of me for teaching these people about these days, because Bob loves this time of year. So the first day is All Hallows Eve, which is Halloween. And then that's October 31st. November 1st, we have All Saints' Day. And that's the day where we honor those who have been particularly influential in the Christian faith. So that whole litany of by faith Abel, by faith Moses, by faith Gideon is remembered on All Saints' Day. These are the stories of the saints of the church, particularly those who were martyred, who have had an impact on the faith. And then on November 2nd, one that we don't celebrate very often in our tradition, is All Souls Day. And on All Souls Day, you remember those that are close to you, your friends and your family who are invisible to the wider church, but they had an impact on you. All Souls Day, the Day of the Dead. And so the story Coco takes place on this festival day somewhere in Mexico, Dia de los Muertes. I just love saying that, so expect to hear it a lot. So on this day, families set up an altar de muertes, and this becomes the tangible way for people to remember those that they loved but have moved on. And so on this altar are symbols and pictures. You saw it in the clip. Pictures which are mementos of the ancestors, maybe the food that they liked, and it's all set up on this altar. And then this serves as the bridge between life and death. And on the streets and on the altar are strewn petals from this kind of orange marigold that is so beautiful, because that's the traditional flower that's used to honor the dead in Mexico. And they put these paths on the streets so that the ancestors will know the way to their house. Because on this one day, those who have passed and those who are here can celebrate together, the living and the dead. They can share a meal in the same space. So Coco is actually the great-grandmother of the hero of our story, who is Miguel, the little boy. Coco's father was a musician who left the family to follow his dream of being famous for his music, and he never came back. And so as a result, Coco's mother, the great-great-grandmother, her name is Esmeralda, she decreed that there would be no more music in their house. And to make ends meet, she became a shoemaker, and all of Miguel's family, for those 3 generations, have been involved in the family business. And even after Esmeralda died, they've honored her wish to keep music out of their lives. There's this picture that you saw in the clip of Esmeralda and Coco as a baby. And her husband, the father who left to pursue music, has had his face ripped out of the picture, even on the family altar. But the trouble for Miguel is that he loves music. And he has also a kind of altar or a shrine which he has set up behind the sign on the family business. It's to this man called Ernesto de la Cruz. who was the greatest singer in all of Mexico, loved for his wonderful music that he wrote and these romantic movies that he starred in and the love that he lavished on the people. Ernesto de la Cruz was from his hometown. And then through a number of different incidents, Miguel comes to believe that Ernesto de la Cruz is his great-great-grandfather. And he decides that he's going to steal his guitar from the mausoleum where he's buried so that he can enter a music contest held that evening and finally show the world that he is a musician. But as he's there in that building, he strums the guitar on this bed of marigold petals, which had been set out, and he's transported into the land of the dead. And he's told there that the only way to get back to the land of the living is to receive a blessing from his family. And because his great-great-grandmother, who he meets there, refuses to bless him unless he promises to give up music, he decides to find Ernesto, his great-great-grandfather, the famous singer, and get his blessing so he can return to the land of the living. So meanwhile, there's this lineup at what's customs in the land of the dead on the other side of these people who are trying to make it back to the land of the living for this Day of the Dead. And the only way they can pass from the land of the dead to the living is if someone has your picture on their altar back in the real world. And so there's this one character who's makes all kinds of disguises. His first one is of Frida Kahlo. We see her a lot in this film, these eyebrows. If anyone who knows Frida Kahlo, the artist, she had these really thick eyebrows. She figures prominently in this film because she is such a Spanish icon. But he tries all these different ways to get through, and they take this X-ray photo, and every time, nope, your picture's not there, you can't go. His name is Hector. So Miguel meets Hector, and he can't go because nobody has put a picture on their altar, a picture of Hector. In the land of the dead, you only survive as long as someone in the land of the living remembers you. So once all the people who have ever known you are gone and there are no more stories of you, you are finally erased and you disappear even from the land of the dead. That is called the final death. And Hector, this trickster, knows that his daughter is getting old and he wants to see her one more time. So he needs to get his picture to her on the altar so he can see her and pass into the land of the living. And Miguel promises, take me to Ernesto, my great-great-grandfather. I will take the picture back to your daughter. But what Miguel discovers when he finally meets Ernesto, which is often the truth when you dig through your past, is that Ernesto is not actually a nice man. He's very selfish, and he had killed a music partner and stolen all of his music. And when he finds out that Miguel knows this, he decides, I am not sending you back to the land of the living because my reputation is so important. And the reason he'd killed his partner is because he had said, family is more important than music, and I want to go back. And so eventually, you probably guessed this, because it's a Disney film, it's pretty easy. Miguel discovers that Ernesto is not his great-great-grandfather, Hector is. Hector is the one who wanted to go back to his family. Hector is the one who Ernesto had murdered and stolen his music. And he tells Miguel that when Coco, his great-grandmother, who is his daughter, was small, he would sing her a song, and the song was called Remember Me, something that she would know always that he was with her. So, of course, Miguel gets back to the land of the living, and there is Coco, that old great-great-grandmother with the braids. And she is failing. She's almost forgotten her father. But Miguel sings that song to her, and once again, she remembers. And she takes out the ripped corner from the photo that she had kept all those years, and she places it on the altar. And so his ancestors, including Hector, who finally has his picture there, join them for a meal for one day, the living and the dead together in this thin place. I suppose there's lots of lessons to learn from this movie. One is sometimes you can't trust the people, even in your own life. And maybe there's this lesson about how important music is and you can never stamp it out. But I think the most important thing that Miguel learns is that family is the most important thing. That even music, as life-giving as it is and as passionate as his notes had become, cannot replace the love of a family. So Miguel learns that honoring his forebears and sharing a meal with his family is the way that his ancestors actually come to life. There's this trend amongst self-help books and gurus, probably for the last 10, 15 years, that encourages us to live in the moment. This idea that the now is the most important time. We're not to agonize over our future or wallow in the past. And obviously, you need to pay attention to the moment. You got to be present. But there's something so shallow about the idea that our past can be erased somehow or forgotten, or that it has no influence on our now or on our future. Of course, there are things we need to release, but there are also people and lessons that should be remembered and honored, like sacred gifts that illuminate our lives. And if we forget the ancestors, we lose the depth of our living. How narrow is the space that allows only us, only our time, only our problems? Remembrance is a sacred act. I think the closest I ever came to celebrating the Day of the Dead was actually when I was on my internship in Oyen. There's this small town called Laverna. Maybe some of you have been through it, across the Saskatchewan border. Laverna is a small place, but it has a big cemetery. And once a year they hold a celebration. And the people, the relatives of the ones who are dead, come and they clean up the graves of their ancestors, and they put flowers up. They actually call it Decoration Day. And then after that, they hold a service of remembrance. It's not in November. I guess out on the prairies, an outdoor service in November might not be a wise thing. And so they hold it in August. And the day I was there, it was the best the prairies had to offer. It was hot, and it was windy, and it was ever so bright. And for the sermon, I told the story of my great-grandfather, Olaf Karbel, who'd come from Sweden as a young boy. He'd actually been put on a boat when he was 12 years old, all by himself, ostensibly because his stepmother didn't like him. And he was sent to be an indentured servant, actually, on a farm in South Dakota. And Olaf came to Alberta, it's said, because his brother had gone before him, or someone, his friend said, come to Alberta, there's no trees. You can just get right to farming, because in Minnesota you had to clear the land, of course. So he came to Alberta as this great hope. And his family, like others on the prairies, suffered through drought and scarlet fever and depression and war. But he persisted. He left the farm when some of his children died of scarlet fever. But since then, his family has grown and prospered, and throughout, their faith has secured them. And so on that day, as I looked out on those prairies, and I remembered my grandfather, I was in this thin space, this place between the living and the dead, when the divine infuses all. And then I heard a story about masses in Nicaragua and El Salvador and other Latin American countries that have struggled through these oppressive dictatorships in the past. And people would be murdered or they would disappear on a weekly basis. You might remember Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop of San Salvador. And he'd come to speak out against poverty and torture and injustice, and he was assassinated in 1980 while offering mass at a hospital with some nuns. So during this time in those countries when daily folks were lost to their families, they would come to Mass on Sunday, and they would name all of those who had disappeared in the last week. And as they spoke a name, the congregation would say together, presente. They are present. And I think this is the embodiment of that scripture we read. We are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. And though we here may not have had family members who were arrested or murdered, still their lives of faith and humble service, like my grandfather Olaf, are not forgotten. We remember them as they've inspired us to be strong and to have courage and to practice our faith and continue to proclaim the gospel with each generation. And I think just like in that Dia de los Muertes, they are here in our sanctuary. They are presente. The Eucharist, our communion, is this ritual of remembrance. The liturgy generally is really a thanksgiving prayer. And usually in the middle of this prayer is a recitation of the history of how God has worked amongst God's people from the very beginning. And of course, then we especially remember Jesus and his life and his death and his life again. But if we continue on that journey, we end up here, in this place, at this time. And with us are all those who have gone before. And so today, as we prepare our communion liturgy, and if someone could go get the children, that would be wonderful. I thought that instead of reciting the work of God through the saints, we're going to remember the souls who are part of your lives. So the song that Hector sang called Remember Me, I'm going to sing a verse from that song from the movie Coco. And then I'm going to invite you to stand and say the name of someone who's gone from us, who is also present. And then we will all say together, presente, to recognize their place amongst us. Presente.